Welcome to this week's Eccentric Minute, brought to you by Eccentric. This week's Eccentric Minute is one of my favorite exercises to do with the K-Pulley, and that is the pull-through. Guys, once you've figured out about how far you need to walk out with the K-Pulley, grab whatever attachment you're using for the pulley, walk yourself out there, and really push your hips back at the K-Pulley. From there, when you hit that stretch, really punch your hips forward, keep your chest up, and try to extend your knees and your hips all the way through. And this is where one of the major benefits of using a flywheel kicks in, as it pulls you into a deeper stretch as you push your hips back into your hamstrings and your hip extensors, so that you really open it up and stretch everything out in the back. This is an exercise that I'm sure your athletes are going to love to hate, but reap awesome rewards from. I really hope you enjoyed this week's Eccentric Minute. Make sure you check them out at eccentric.com to find out everything you need about the K-Box and the K-Pulley. Being a strength and conditioning professional requires constant pursuit of better knowledge, better methods, and better means. But what if there was a place where strength and conditioning coaches could learn from some of the most innovative practitioners in the world, such as Jeff Moyer, Lachlan Wilmot, William Wayland, James the Thinker Smith, and Keir Wenham Flatt? Well, you could find multiple lectures from each of these top-level coaches and a few lectures and examples from yours truly as well, all in the Strength Coach Network. The Strength Coach Network is going to bring you well over 100 different lectures from some of the top practitioners in the world to be your one-stop shop for your continuing education and professional development. So hop on over to strengthcoachnetwork.com/CVASP today and get your 48-hour trial for only $1. That's strengthcoachnetwork.com/CVASPS to get your 48-hour trial for only $1. I look forward to seeing you in the Strength Coach Network. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. Today, guys, we are going to discuss fatigue in the sport of basketball with Oklahoma's Assistant Director of Basketball Strength and Performance Scientist, Aaron Heischman. After a real quick intro of how Aaron got down to Norman, guys, we are going to dive right into what he's looking at with his dissertation and how his time in Charlottesville really drove the bus into this educational venue that he's running down right now. You know, and initially what he was looking at was how training loads affected jump height, and this has got him to run down the force plate rabbit hole and look at acute changes in performance, readiness, and fatigue from day to day based on outputs at practice. And he's going to look at those alongside endocrine responses and perceptual responses, and he's going to really get into all of this, along with looking at some alternatives to jumping as other test outputs that we can use for our athletes in order to make sure that we're able to look at not just central, but peripheral fatigue. This is really an awesome talk, guys. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Let's get right to it. Aaron, thank you so much for spending the time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Listen, I'm fired up for this one. It's been a while, man. You know, it's not as easy to get to the 804 from Norman, Oklahoma as it was from Charlottesville. But let's get everybody caught up with what Aaron's been up to and, you know, where you're at and how you got down there.
So this is my first year as the assistant director of basketball performance here at University of Oklahoma. I'm also have a role as a sports scientist for the university. This is actually my fourth year on campus here, though. I came to Norman in 2016 to pursue my PhD in exercise physiology. I had a unique situation set up starting kind of at my master's. I worked at the University of Virginia. I got my master's in exercise physiology. I worked under arguably the best strength coach in the country, Mike Curtis, specifically for basketball. So when I was there, he put me I learned training a lot, and also that there's a large use of science and using science to improve performance. So that really caught my interest, and I decided I want to get my PhD through my master's project there. From there, I got contacted with a mentor here on campus in Norman, and then also Coach Curtis knew Bryce Dobb, who is our director of performance here, and working with those two, I kind of got a situation where I could work in the applied setting with my PhD, so I could continue to grow as a coach, a performance practitioner, but then also do valuable research in the applied setting, which I think there's at times a paucity of, because a lot of good practitioners don't have the time to do the research. So I volunteered here for 3 years as I helped with training. I was incorporated in kind of all aspects of the performance model, but then also helped initiate a lot of the sports science interests that we have rolling. And then the job popped up open this past summer, and I was thankful enough and lucky to get it. So yeah, that's how I got here.
Yeah, dude. And I think it's kind of awesome how it's really working full circle from your time in Charlottesville to now down in Norman, where we're looking at, like, at that time in 2016 is really when things started going, when it came to the fatigue monitoring and load monitoring and things that you guys were building. And obviously Mike has continued to move forward with that. Is, I guess you could say he's doing okay. And
Yeah.
but now coming into a new setting, and this is now driving really what you're doing down there in Norman.
Yeah, absolutely. My research has paralleled really well from what we did in Charlottesville with using Catapult to monitor external loads and having indices of internal training loads, and then also the counter movement jump response. My first research project there through my master's, it was one of the first papers to kind of link in basketball athletes that if we have an increase in external training load, there's a subsequent change in counter movement jump performance. So we had a decrease in jump height in the subsequent days, which seems fairly obvious. But the important thing is, as practitioners and using science to guide training, is you have to document those things. You have to have a defined, structured analysis to say, yes, we do have this link. So they're doing more, and there's a cost of that. That's kind of laid the foundation for when I came here to Norman. A lot of my research has been based around utilizing force plate technology and the counter movement jump specifically to detect acute neuromuscular changes, so we can see modifications in preparedness and also just readiness from a day-to-day standpoint. So I've done a few projects on that, but the research is paralleled very, very nicely. And part of that's because my mentor here at the University of Oklahoma, his name's Mike Bemben, in the neuromuscular laboratory. And he really has given me a lot of autonomy to research the things that I want to do. Bryce has given me a lot of autonomy to say, hey, I think this is important. We should use this. I think we can gain a competitive advantage with this knowledge. And then putting the resources and time into those projects. So it's been really, really beneficial to have that smooth transition.
So now when we're looking at these force plate numbers that you're looking at, what metrics are you looking at? Why did you pick them, and why are they important?
Yeah, so it's a really detailed question, and I think the answer is right now, no one really knows what we should be looking at and what's the most sensitive and specific measurement of fatigue, and then is it really sensitive enough and specific enough to detect fatigue? And that's really what's led me to my dissertation project, and that's why my answer is very vague because I haven't completed that analysis yet. But for my dissertation, we're looking at when an athlete, this is with the men's and women's basketball teams, when an athlete goes through a high external training load exposure in practice based off of player load per minute, what are the subsequent recovery patterns of that? So what do they look like from pre-practice to following that external training load, then at 24 hours, 48 and 72 hours with a clean recovery time course? And what we were able to do is set up and have no other practices in that 72 hours of time. So we can say any changes that we see in these force plate parameters are coming from the fatigue from practice. And then comparing that with the two extremes, hopefully having a large enough effect, we can see that there's a difference in which specific parameters we should be looking at from the force plate. With that, we'll also parallel endocrine responses over that same time course and perceptual responses, because we know fatigue has a physical side and then also a perceptual side. So paralleling like our physical deficits is also with our perceptual deficits to really determine when fatigue occurs in that time course, what's the time course of recovery, and then also hopefully between the two training intensities, we can illuminate the key metrics that's saying, hey, look, there's more load and this guy's at a deficit from that. I have one paper, it just got accepted, the Journal of Sports Science and Sports Medicine, and it was looking at over the course of the preseason. It was kind of a preliminary analysis characterizing our loads during the training, the preseason training phase. So we would kind of know what a high and low external training load was when we exposed them to that for the dissertation study. But really, we saw with increases in external training load, we had modifications in flight time to contraction time and RSI mod, moderate effect sizes with those. And I think that parallels with what a lot of the other research would say, is that you're going to have a change in that movement strategy. But jump height didn't change. The guys were still able to achieve jump height on average. It's just that movement signature became different to achieve that same gross output.
That's interesting because, people talk about that quite regularly, that, just jump height isn't the cat's pajamas when it comes to understanding what's really going on.
For sure. I think that's a multi-tiered issue. One is our guys are really good jumpers and they're really good compensators at achieving gross tasks. If you tell them to do something, they'll be able to achieve that task, and they can compensate to achieve that task, we think. And we see that in the weight room, right? When you ask them to do stuff, it may not be the best pattern, but they can achieve the task. Also, when you're using the force plate technology, with the way, depending on how you compute the jump height, it may not be the best indice with small, subtle changes of increase in your dorsiflexion or small, subtle hip flexion and knee flexion that you can't observe, just like the naked eye, can really affect that displacement value. So we actually have a paper on that too, whether we should be using flight time to contraction time or the impulse method. And we use flight time to contraction time, which seems like a force plates are fairly expensive to use that method with, but we just improve the reliability with it through some of our analysis. We can see we have improved reliability using the flight time method with our players. So that's what we use.
So then what do you think would be the pros and cons of doing it the other way? The impulse method.
So what we saw was that there's literature that says that would be like the more accurate measure. So if you're looking for the most valid parameter and you can get more assessments and dissipate some of that variability in the parameter, if you're looking for the exact measurement, then you might be able to improve that with the impulse method. But using the flight time method, you decrease your variability. So if you're measuring within subject changes, then with less variability, hopefully you can see smallest worthwhile change a bit better.
I love that, because that's really what you're looking for here, right? Is you're not looking for Aaron versus the team. You're looking at Aaron versus Aaron, because at the end of the day, that's Aaron versus Aaron is what's going to affect the team the most, not Aaron versus the team.
Absolutely. I think that's a key point as well. Taking a research mindset versus a practitioner's mindset. So many times in research, we do repeated measures of ANOVAs, analysis of variance, where we're looking at those average differences. But as a coach, a lot of times we need to see smallest worthwhile changes, because we're taking that, it's an N of one with every athlete. So how is this athlete responding? Because that's going to play into the overall team outcomes. While with research, a lot of times we're trying to understand the mechanisms and physiology behind certain outcomes. So we have to do that on average, so we can really get the real effect of an event.
So then what are you
So those
seeing?
results can be applied.
Right. So then what exactly are you seeing? What are some things that Aaron is looking at right now and is either like, okay, or he's like, uh-oh?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing, I think the counter movement jump is a good assessment. I think there will be different assessments that we'll also use. Some people are using like the isometric mid-thigh pull. There's some challenges with that, specifically if you don't have a large Olympic lifting background. There's a large technical proficiency to that. I think those isometric tests, if we can find other ways to assess that, may be equally as important and provide unique information. Also the velocity of contraction. If you look at a lot of the fatigue literature, first off, fatigue is very task specific. So depending on what the practice looks like could affect the type of fatigue manifesting. So really figuring out a way to illuminate what the movement signature in practice is going to be key, and how detailed we can get in that to may be useful. And then also a lot of the research done in like a lot of isometrics or unijoint contractions show deficits in velocity of contraction and not necessarily gross output of contraction. So I think that is another key avenue. The second that was the first part of my dissertation that I described. The second portion of my dissertation, I wanted to get a little bit more invasive and describe the physiological mechanisms that we're seeing after practice and seeing where this fatigue is manifesting if they are getting fatigue after practice. So this is what I'm really interested in is a guy. How does a guy look pre-post practice if we can quantitate the external load in how the muscle is contracting? Like what are the modifications in those contractile properties, and then are there modifications in central versus peripheral fatigue? So where's the main and primary site that fatigue will manifest? Because to send a signal to the musculature, it's a long pathway that a lot of different areas could go wrong with. And obviously fatigue is going to be multifaceted, and there's going to be multiple sites that are affected, but what is the primary site of the deficit? So what I've had the guys do is, and men and women, are from pre to post practice, and then at 24 hours, we do a technique called the twitch interpolation. So we'll do a maximal MVC for 3 seconds, and then we'll do at 2.5 seconds, they'll get a stimulation, a peripheral stimulation of the muscular stimulation of the quadriceps while they're doing an isometric knee extension and of a predetermined current that's their maximal current needed to excite all of the musculature. And so they're kicking, they get the stim at 2.5 seconds, they relax, and then they get two subsequent stimulations so we can kind of see differences in contractile qualities. So with that first portion, as the athlete's kicking, they produce a maximal force. Whatever additive force that we have, we would say that is force that the brain couldn't send a large enough signal to the muscle to contract. So then that would be more of a central deficit in fatigue. If there's no additive forces with exogenous stimulation, then we know that the mechanism is more peripheral because the muscle is just being worked to max capacities there. So starting to delineate how the muscle is contracting or how the body's fatiguing. Is it more centrally or peripherally driven? It's tough because fatigue is so task driven that long duration tasks, if you look at unimuscle or unijoint literature, a lot of the long duration, low intensity tasks cause a lot of centrally driven fatigue, while high intensity exercise causes a lot more peripheral fatigue. So there's some more caveats to that, but but basketball is a combination of that. So looking down the road, is it the duration of practice that is going to play a bigger role in driving more central fatigue, and how can we structure and use tactical periodization to optimize that? Or how long does it take an athlete to recover from a high intensity peripheral high intensity exercises that cause a substantial amount of peripheral fatigue? How long does it take to recover from that? So we know what level of intensities we can hit leading into a game to make sure guys are optimal and have their full physical potential leading into competition. With that as well, we give 2 stimulations following the maximal contraction at rest, and these resting twitch allow us to stimulate the muscle at a high frequency and a low frequency using a doublet and a single twitch. With that, we can start to illuminate if there's low frequency fatigue or high frequency fatigue at present. And it's thought in sport that activities that have a lot of eccentric loading and stretch shortening cycle activity have a increase in low frequency fatigue. Low frequency fatigue is the disproportionate reduction in force at low firing frequency compared to high firing frequencies. So what that means is that the singlet would have a decrease in force, but the high intensity or the high frequency stimulation would stay at the same quantity of force. And this is important because we think low frequency fatigue is insidious, long lasting, will last over an extended period of time. So we're starting to look at that over that pre to post practice, and then at 24 hours to start to delve into how that musculature is responding. We can also take that single twitch and decipher specific in that force time curve. We can see without the brain's input, how does the peripheral muscle contract? So how fast, what's the rate of contraction, rate of force development in an isometric contraction, and then what's the rate of force decline or half relaxation time in that stimulation. So with that, we can start to see if there is a decrease in rate of force development in that isolated twitch, then we know that there's probably substrate accumulation that's inhibiting actin myosin interaction. But if there's a slow half relaxation time, so it takes longer for the muscle to relax, then there's probably modifications in calcium ATPase and reuptake of that calcium to get the muscle to contract. So these are all just peripheral mechanisms that we're starting to try to kind of illuminate because it could affect one, tactical periodization and how we lead train guys in prior to competition, as well as looking at different recovery modalities to mitigate some of those.
And all of this is tagged back into looking at what these outputs were at practice and what actual metrics you're taking off of the accelerometer and the GPS sensors.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also with all of those time points, I overlined it with the counter movement jump. So we can start to see, is there these laboratory-based measurements that we would usually use for fatigue? Are there paralleling metrics that are at a deficit that we also see at a deficit on the force plate when we dissect that force time curve? So we can start to parallel those two. And then that's going to give us, I think, a better answer of saying, hey, I think these are the most essential parameters for people who can't do the twitch interpolation, or you don't have time to do that technique, then you can say, hey, look, we should use these from our force parameter in the applied setting to look at fatigue or see if our athletes are recovering from stimuli.
That's awesome, dude. So then I guess the next question that I would have for you is, this is all going to be extremely individually based research and protocols. So where do you feel that this is then going to drive future questions and better abilities for practitioners to be able to prescribe what I want to say, or monitor or modify to make sure that these young people aren't going through the grind, all the time that we love to call it?
Right. Or making sure they are going through the grind as well, because if you never get
Touché.
those deficits, then it's like, so that's one of the big pieces. We are so focused on and I've said it this whole time, it's like, oh, they're fatigued after practice, right? What if they're not, right? What if we have no changes? Maybe practice is a potentiating experience and an acute bout of it. So stringing together multiple practices is really the next step, but you need to break it down and see an individual response, and then we can start to stack those on top of each other. And understanding with these assessments and measurements, understanding how the athlete responds is going to be imperative and very applicable to many practitioners, because one of the things with external load monitoring right now, a lot of people collect external training load, right? They have catapult units. A lot of people just collect the data. Some people don't use it. Then you have the next people that collect it and do changes and try to structure practice with varying external training loads. There's not good evidence right now that there's a substantial difference that if I do 500 player load or 700 player load, if there's going to be a substantial difference in acute fatigue following that. So like the day before the game, is it a big deal if will there be ramifications at 24 hours if I do 500 more player load today, or even 200 player load? There's one paper in rugby that kind of illuminated that, but we have a different game. So I think it's important to kind of go down that track, but linking those two, and then what are the key parameters from the catapult system or what are key tasks that are going to be more fatiguing, or other key questions. Should we be using the IMA data? Is it just the total quantity of work? Is it the quantity of jumps that the athlete experienced? So there's a lot of questions I think that build from that. This is kind of just laying that foundational framework so we can start to penetrate some of those questions.
Well, and even more so, is it that it's 500 or 700, or is it that it was 300 yesterday and 700 today? Or is it that the
100%.
average is 600 and all of a sudden it's 900? Like, where does these one-offs, I think, are like,
Yep.
kind of, I mean, we've all had the day where practice hasn't been great and it's supposed to go for 75 minutes and it goes for 75 minutes, like
Yeah,
probably 75 minutes
absolutely.
more. So what do those do? I think that that's an even more intriguing setup.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely where we're going with it. But without knowing the individual responses from acute event, then it's hard to stack days because the days get so convoluted. So we're trying to break those down, and then we start to decipher through more complex scenarios or even weekly training loads, and how that looks over multiple weeks with greater precision if we understand this kind of acute time course of recovery.
No, I love it, man, because then, too, what would be even more exciting as that progresses, right, is not just understanding what that acute load to recovery time is, but how long is that acute load actually an acute load before it's just, how long is it a developmental load before it's a stimulatory load, right? Like,
For
because
sure.
eventually it can't be the same.
Absolutely. It's very, very true. I think that it even starting to parallel the different training phases as well of like, here's what is a developmental load or a stimulatory load in the off season compared to in season play, compared to, competitive season phase one where you're in their non-conference or even postseason play. Have we built like a certain resilience by that time point that we can actually handle more, or we can even handle more perturbations and load throughout different training phases? I think a lot of our understanding of this is still relatively low compared to where it could be.
No doubt about it, brother. Well, listen, Aaron, let me get you out of here on this, man. You're already talking about papers you got published. Where can people find more? Where can they dig into this? Where can they keep track of how this is progressing? Because this is really some fascinating stuff.
So a lot of the work's been in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. I think that's a great article that gives practically useful research to practitioners. There's also an open access journal called Sports MDPI. And they'll do many special issues on different topics. I really like the journal because it's open access, and it's some practitioners may not have access to the library inventory or a variety of different journals. So that open access, I love publishing open access journals because then anybody can read it, and we can get more conversation about the data to kind of improve future studies and improve perspectives. Also, the International Journal of Sports, IJSPP, International Journal of Sports Performance and Physiology, another great journal. In the Journal of, I was just reading this morning from the Journal of the Frontier in Physiology. It's also another great journal. It'll have some training load and training monitoring literature in there as well.
Awesome, brother. We'll make sure that we get your stuff put up there and it's in the show notes because this is great stuff, man. Truly appreciate all your work and all you're doing to help us be better, Aaron. And as always, it's great catching up, brother.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, man. Well, we'll be in touch real soon, brother. Cheers.
Sounds great.
Yeah, man. And a huge thanks to Oklahoma's Aaron Heischman for spending the time with us today. Guys, open, honest, candid sharing from a man doing the research and looking at it, really, turning these stones over to be able to look at fatigue. Is it central? Is it peripheral? Is it high frequency? Is it low frequency? Is it going to be lasting or not? And being able to find different evaluations so we can all be better with what we do with our athletes. I can't thank Aaron enough for not just his open, honest, and candid sharing with us today, but for the work he's doing with his dissertation to help us all try to be better. So Aaron, thank you so much, brother. Keep up the great work. We really appreciate it. And as always, guys, if you did enjoy the talk, please share it through the social media outlet of your choice. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it may be. As always, we are just trying to get the best information out there to all the great coaches that we can. And as always, guys, thank you for everything that you do for us here at Central Virginia Sport Performance. We will be back next week with another awesome guest. We will see you then.